This is week 2 of our series about outcasts. Last week, Jesus kind of set the stage for us, if you recall. He was teaching people, and he was attracting some unsavory characters. It says that sinners and tax collectors were coming to listen. And it was really no surprise that those kinds of people were coming to listen to him if you listen to the stories that he was telling. He was telling stories about God finding lost people and bringing them back. People that seemed just outside. People that just seemed like unredeemable. And he told one of those most famous stories in the Bible, one that we all know, the story of the prodigal son, about how this kid took his inheritance, spent it all, and then comes back home expecting, well, I guess I could just at least go and live with dad and work in the fields, and at least I won't starve. And his dad just pulls out all the stops, has a big party, kills the fatted calf, they're singing, they're dancing, he gets a new robe, he gets a new ring, he gets it all. And some people aren't happy about that. Because that's not, there have to be consequences for our actions. There have to be rules. There needs to be standards. And Jesus seems to be saying, well, the thing that overcomes all of that is God's amazing mercy. But that really wasn't that threatening, because that was just a story. Right? It's a story. It didn't actually happen. So today, it's what happens. What happens to some of those tax collectors and sinners that hear these stories that Jesus tells? And tax collectors show up a lot in the Bible. They really do. They show up a lot in Luke. In fact, at the very beginning of Luke's gospel, before Jesus is really on the scene, except for his birth, John the Baptist is preaching fire and brimstone. Literally. He's literally preaching fire and brimstone. He's saying, the Lord is coming and he's going to baptize you with fire. I baptize you with water, but he's coming with fire. And people are getting nervous about this, but there were some tax collectors listening to John the Baptizer. And the tax collectors say, so, John, what should we do? And surprisingly, astonishingly, John the Baptist doesn't say, give up your dirtbag jobs. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say, you guys are ripping people off, you're working with the Romans. Done. Forget it. He doesn't say that. He says, don't collect any more than what you're told. Don't collect any more taxes than you're obligated. Because the way the system worked is the tax collectors kind of bought the right to collect taxes, and then they squeezed as much as they possibly could in order to get rich. So it's amazing that John basically just says, be a good tax collector. That's like in our culture saying, be a nice drug dealer. Be an upstanding strip club owner. That's the connotation in that context, right? It totally disconnects with people. They can't wrap their minds around it. And so tax collectors are hearing that message. And then Jesus walked along in chapter 5, Luke, Jesus comes across a tax collector and says to him, hey, come on and follow me. And he does. He follows Jesus. He leaves his tax collecting table and he goes and follows Jesus, becomes one of the disciples. You might recognize his name. It was Matthew. I think there's a book. And then you go a little further along, you find that Jesus is attracting the tax collectors. They're listening to him. They listen to these stories, including the story of the prodigal son. And then Jesus tells another story about a tax collector. Jesus says, there's two guys that went up to the temple. One was a Pharisee, very upstanding religious leader, perfect citizen. The other was a dirtbag tax collector. So the Pharisee goes in and says, God, I am so grateful that you made me me and not like these other dirtbags. I'm so glad that you made me the way I am. I go to church every Sabbath. I tithe. I'm just so good. Thank you for making me like me. And the tax collector comes in, and he can't even look up at the altar and says, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And you know what Jesus says? He says, so which one of these two guys do you think went home justified in God's sight? You know the answer, right? The tax collector. So Jesus is really stretching people. He's just leaning on their buttons hard because people can't really wrap their minds around this. So the next thing that happens in the gospel is that we see what happens to a real tax collector who's listening to these stories. Jesus goes into Jericho, and there's this guy named Zacchaeus, who's not just a tax collector, he's a chief tax collector. In other words, he sends out other guys to steal people's money. And just in case you were wondering, the text tells us, and he was rich. He's been good at this tax farming thing. He's raking in the dough. And Zacchaeus wants to see Jesus. Now, why do you suppose he wants to see Jesus? My guess is that he's one of these tax collectors that's been listening to Jesus tell these stories. Maybe Zacchaeus was even one of those guys that heard from John the Baptist and not extort extra money out of him. Maybe Zacchaeus is turning his life around. And he wants to connect with Jesus. And I think that's kind of what's happening. We usually hear this story as the story of Zacchaeus climbs the tree, and of course we have to have it. Zacchaeus was a wheelman, was he? I don't like that story. And we tell the story, that Jesus sees Zacchaeus, tells him to come down, and then Zacchaeus, Jesus comes into Zacchaeus' house, and this is the transforming moment for Zacchaeus, right? All of a sudden, he realizes that he's been a dirtbag, and now he's going to do right. The thing is, though, I'm not sure that that's really the way the story goes. Zacchaeus doesn't say any of the standard repentance language, right? He doesn't say to Jesus, I'm sorry, I'm ready to turn my life around now. And if you were really observant and you were reading along while I was reading, you may have noticed that in the NRSV translation that we use, the verbs that Zacchaeus uses are future tense, right? He says, if I have defrauded anyone, I will pay them back 4 times. And I will give half my money to the poor. The only problem is, in the original, it's present tense. He's already doing it. He's already saying, if I defraud people, I give back 4 times. And I'm giving half of my money to the poor. He's already doing it. See, because he's already listened to John the Baptist. He's already listened to Jesus tell the story of the prodigal son. He's already listened to this stuff, and he knows what he's called to do, and so he's already doing it. But here's the thing. When somebody is a dirtbag like that, when somebody is an outcast like that, even when they start doing the right thing, the rest of us still hate them. I mean, think about it. When we look at somebody who was just a terrible person, doing terrible things, and they make a turn, Are we happy? Are we like, yes, this horrible person is now doing good. We should embrace them. More often than not, we say, this horrible person is trying to make up for all the horrible things they did, and it ain't working. They're still a horrible person. That's why Jesus is in it now. Because everybody else is still saying, sinner, sinner. Yeah, sure, he's kind of made up for it a little bit. He's given some people their money back, but he's still a tax collector. He's still evil. We're never going to believe that he's really turned his life around. Jesus comes into his house and says, salvation has come to this house. Salvation, which isn't just a get out of hell free card. Salvation is healing, wholeness, peace, and restoration, and he restores Zacchaeus' identity. He says, this too is a son of Abraham. He's still part of the family. He's still one of us. Welcome home, outcasts. Welcome home. And that's what Jesus does. That's what Jesus still does. That's what Jesus inspires us to do.